The Westerners are very fond of saying that music developed independently in India and the West, but I find that highly suspicious. Why would the same tonal ratios be used to define the scales in India and in the West? That's a question that we should ask ourselves. When we have a sa re ga ma pa da ni sa, why is the same as do re mi fa sol la ti do? It's the same thing, right? Same differences in ratios and other things. This similarity has come because they had a common origin. That common origin is in India, which is what I'm talking about over here. How mathematics was used to define the ratios, how were the ratios known, how ancient Indians, even perhaps from Bharata Muni, if not earlier, how they understood the relationship F is inversely proportional to the length of the string. Through that, they could define where the frets should be on the veena in order to create the various notes. We have got how knowledge systems have gone out of India in various time frames to different geographies. I have evidences for each of these things. This used to happen between 200 BC till about 400 current era. So the Romans from the Mediterranean Sea would land at Alexandria in Egypt, and through a land bridge, they go up in the caravans up to the Red Sea. Namaste, I am Raj Vedam. So today I'd like to talk to you about the historicity of Indian knowledge systems, and in particular, I'd like to talk to you about the history of music. Now, we have a fascinating and deep history of music in India, and in this talk, I hope to bring out some aspects of that. So to start with, I'll talk to you about some archaeological finds on music in India. I will continue to discuss some textual evidences for music in India. Then I will talk to you about applications of mathematics in music. This is a fascinating relationship because in India we have a very unique trajectory of the growth of mathematics as well as music, and the two are deeply intertwined. Then finally, I'll talk to you about the transmission of music from India to other cultures. So let us first start with talking about the archaeological finds for music and instruments. Would you believe that as far back as almost 12,000 years ago in Madhya Pradesh, in the caves in Bhimbetka, we have rock carvings or paintings of people who are dancing. You see groups of people holding hands and dancing, and drummers who are drumming. So this is clear evidence of the practice of music in a very, very ancient period of time, almost 12,000 years ago in Bhimbetka. So we have evidence in Harappa of wind instruments. This particular fascinating toy was recovered in Harappa from almost 3000 BCE or 2500 BCE. It's dated to that time frame. And this is similar to the toys that you find in toy stores, for example. It looks like a little bird, which is made out of terracotta with holes in it for whistling. You can fill that bird partially with water and blow into it. As you blow into it, it will make chirping sounds, whistling sounds, and these kinds of sounds. It is evidence to us that our ancestors, more than 5,000 years ago, were already practicing with wind instruments and with making various kinds of sounds and so on. One more fascinating instrument called borindo. This is found in Sindh, basically near Mohenjo-daro and places like that. Once again, going back to 3000 BCE, it looks like an earthen pot, a small pot of this size or so, with 5 holes in it, and the practitioner could hold those holes and make tunes out of these things. If you search on YouTube, you might find some practitioners from Sindh who are performing and showing how this instrument was played almost 5,000 years ago. And moving forward in time, we also have a fascinating artifact from Madhya Pradesh. This is in a place called Pachmarhi in the Nimbu Boj. That's a place. It dates back from the second millennium BC, almost 4,000 years ago, 2000 BCE. And what is amazing about this is this rock painting is showing a person sitting down and playing a bow instrument, a bow harp with some strings on it. and there's a resonator box on the side, very, very similar to what you might see in Veena today, the precursor of the Veena, if you will. And so this is clear evidence that from very early period of time, Indians are already playing these kind of stringed instruments. And one more thing that I found very interesting was that there's a connection between Babylon and ancient India. For example, in Tamil Nadu or in the southern parts of India, including Karnataka, we have got a drum called thambatam. And this was known in Babylon as Timbuktu, if I'm pronouncing that right. So this was a round instrument on which you stretch the skin and you play the drum on this side. And even today, you've got people who dance and play these kinds of drums. So this drum was called Timbuktu in Babylon. It was called thambatam in southern India. And one more reference is there in the Old Testament to King David's time in Babylon. And they had an instrument called the kinnor. Now, the kinnor is directly related to the kinnari. The kinnari is in southern India. It was a stringed instrument, very similar to what you might find in ancient Veenas and those kinds of things. So what it is telling us is that even at this very early period of time, Indians are already transmitting their knowledge to places like Babylon and having this kind of musical exchanges. Then if we go to the Rig Veda, we have got several instruments mentioned there. For example, there's an instrument called Nali. This is there in Rig Veda, the reference is 10.135.7. It's a wind instrument, very similar to the flute. Then we have got drums called Dundubi, which is used to keep rhythm. For example, Rig Veda 1.28.51. We have got a Veena-like instrument called the Vana, and this is in Rig Veda 1.85.10. Rig Veda also mentions Saptaswara. I'll talk a little more about this later. And also we have instruments called Karkari, Rig Veda 2.43.3, that talks about these. So what is becoming increasingly clear is that in archaeological finds, we got a deep history of music. Now, if you go to the work called Natya Shastra by Bharata Muni, it can be dated anywhere from 500 BC to 200 BC, you can date him. And this work is referencing 4 categories of instruments. We got stringed instruments, we got wind instruments, we got percussion instruments, and instruments that don't require tuning. These are solid instruments that don't require tuning. So what is clear from these is that in India, we had various categories of instruments and obviously practitioners who would play these instruments in addition. Now going to specific instances, the Bansuri flute. It's a beautiful flute with a deep sound. You might find icons of Krishna playing the Bansuri flute. This is mentioned both in Rig Veda as well as in the Natya Shastra. We also have archaeological finds of flutes in Harappa. Now, Veena, like I told you earlier, is mentioned in the Rig Veda, Atharva Veda, Taittiriya Samhita, Shatapatha Brahmana, Natya Shastra. All these things are referencing the Veena. And we have an evolution there too. We have the Rudra Veena going to the Saraswati Veena. So there's been an evolution of the instruments and the way it is performed in addition. And today we have a researcher called Shail Vyas, who's trying to reconstruct what some of the Harappan instruments might have looked like, both the 10-stringed instruments, percussion instruments, wind instruments, and so on. So if you research for his name, Shail Vyas, you might find some of the instruments he's trying to recreate. It's fascinating to see what Harappa might have had in that early period of time. Then coming all the way once again to southern India, we got the very familiar nāda, which is a huge wind kind of instrument. It is mentioned in the Sangamira Tamil text itself, which can be dated to a very early period of time. Some people say 300 BC, maybe much, much earlier than that too. It is mentioned also in Silappatikaram, which is an ancient work, story of Kannagi and so on. So this could have been the inspiration for trumpet itself. The later trumpet that makes its way in Egypt and Babylon and places like that, the Nadaswaram could have been the inspiration for some of these things. Then we know that the ancestor of the violin itself was an instrument called Ravana Hatha. So this instrument we know, even today you might find street musicians who will have a bow in one hand and the stringed instrument in the other hand, and they're playing it. And so this is the ancestor of the violin itself. This instrument, when during Muslim invasions it went to Arabia, it became something called a rebab in places like Cairo and places like that. And from there, in the 10th and 11th century, it made its way to Europe. And in Europe, it became the violin. So we know the ancestor of violin was a Ravana Hatha, which is from India itself. Then we have a whole lot of evidences if you go to the temples in India. Various temples in different parts of India have got sculptures that clearly show the practice of music. For example, in Tamil Nadu, if you go to the Pallava temples, from 600 to 800 current era, places like Mahabalipuram, Kanchipuram, and other such places, you will find instances of people who are playing the flute, people who are playing the veena, people who are playing the drums. So these kind of instruments are clearly over there in different places in the Pallava temples, in various places, like I said. Then also in Karnataka, if you go to the Chalukya era, from 540 current era to 750 current era, we find in beautiful temple carvings, we are seeing the practice of music. We are seeing people who are playing the drums, people who are playing the flute, people who are playing the veena, and singers and dancers and these things, clearly showing how music was practiced in those days. So there are some more slides in which you can see how instruments are shown in Chalukya temples and so on. And if you go to the Hoysalas, by the time we come to Hoysalas, we're talking in Karnataka about 1100 current era to 1300 current era. Beautiful temples are there in Halebeedu and places like that, which show with magnificent sculptures that show the practice of the Saraswati veena, the Damaru kind of drum, and these kinds of things. So clear evidence is there that throughout India, musical practice was going on. And we also see the veena, the violin precursor, as well as solid instruments being played. All these things can be seen in Hoysala temples in this time frame. So what I've shown to you so far is some archaeological evidences going to 12,000 years ago in Bhimbetka, going to Harappa. Then I talked to you instances from some of the Vedic literature, going on to temples in the Pallava temples, the Chola temples, the Hoysalas and others. I've shown to you different musical instruments and these things. Now I'd like to talk to you about texts, because music is mentioned in many, many ancient texts. I'd like to give you some references to these things. So first of all, let's talk about the Yajnavalkya Smriti, which is 3.115. Now, Yajnavalkya can be dated to 3000 BCE, almost 5000 years ago. And how do we know that? You might have to see some of my earlier talks where I use astronomical phenomena in Shatapatha Brahmana to date Yajnavalkya to 3000 BCE. So in Yajnavalkya Smriti, there's a reference to what kind of person is a good musician, right? So let me read this out. This is saying a person who is well versed in the principles of playing the veena, who understands the intricacies of the Shruti, musical notes, and the Jati, which is the melodic form, and who's knowledgeable about Tala, which is the rhythm, attains moksha with little effort. So in other words, it is saying that this person must be well versed not only in musical notes, the melodic form, the rhythm, you should know all these things well. That is what makes you a good musician. Then we have an amazing reference in the Taittiriya Aranyaka 10.1.6, where it says, Devaki Putram Govindam Vishnum. So it is roughly translates to Govinda Vishnu, who is the son of Devaki. Now this is referencing Krishna, right? And this is there in the Taittiriya Aranyaka. The Taittiriya literature also comes from Yajnavalkya. So once again, we can say associated with the date of 3000 BCE, because that's where we have dated Yajnavalkya to. That means Krishna and the references to Krishna are even earlier than 3000 BCE. In this time frame, we have also seen that a flute is known in Harappa. So it's not surprising that in Indian literature, we talk about Krishna with a flute. We know that because even in Harappa, we have recovered artifacts from this time frame. Now, when we talk about the flute and Krishna, there's a deep symbolism. So several Puranas, they present Krishna and the flute. For example, the Bhagavata Purana, the Vishnu Purana, the Brahma Vaivarta Purana. All these things have different references to Krishna and how he plays the flute and the philosophical discussions around these things. So in their works, we see that Krishna's divine music, it enraptures entire creation, because it is said that humans, animals, trees, rivers, everything stopped when Krishna is playing his music because they are so enthralled by this music. They're sitting and listening to it. So there's a deep symbolism, like I said, of Krishna playing the flute. And the flute itself is an ego-free instrument. For example, like the human heart, likened to the human heart. And Krishna, when he's breathing into the flute, that is a divine spirit or the prana itself. And the flute music is a call of Bhagavan over here, which is the vibration of creation itself. And the gopis who respond to the music with dancing and so on, it is our Atman's yearning to know Bhagavan, right? That's what it is. And when there's silence after the music is played, it is symbolic of the state of union, when there is samadhi or there's rasa, where we are enjoying what we just heard. So there is a deep symbolism shown in Indian works when we talk about Krishna and playing of the flute itself. So there's one more very interesting aspect I'd like to talk to you about, which is Krishna and the Yamuna river, which is recounted in, again, Puranic literature. Now the Bhagavata Purana in 10.21, it states very poetically that rivers stop flowing to listen to Krishna when he starts playing the flute. There is a deeper exposition of this in the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, in the Krishna Janma Khanda, at chapters 63 to 64. It has a very poetic description. It says, hearing the sweet music of the flute, the Yamuna swelled and turned her course, desiring to touch Govinda's feet. Now, when I read this, I said, this is amazing, because there is cultural memory of an actual geological event in the past. If you look at the hydrological history of the rivers in northern India around this time frame, in 1900 BCE, approximately 4,000 years ago, we had several tectonic plate movements in the Himalayan belt, and some of them were so severe that the Yamuna river that used to feed into the ancient Saraswati river, that changed its course and started flowing eastwards, literally towards Vrindavan and other areas, and going on this route. So this seems to be a remembrance of an ancient event which is poetically expressed in the Puranas itself. I found that to be very fascinating, the account in Brahma Vaivarta Purana. Then if we look at the antiquity of music, I've alluded to you earlier that it was there in Rig Veda itself. Now we look at more instances from the Vedic literature. For example, Rig Veda 9.11.4, we have the word saman. Now saman originally means a melodious chant. So later on it became the basis for the Samaveda itself. For example, sing forth the saman, let the soma flow, Rig Veda 9.11.4. Then we also have in other Rig Vedic verses, for example, 1.10.11, we have reference to Gatha or Gita. So the root is Gai. Gai means to sing. This is frequent. It is from here we get Gana, which is song, and Geetam, which is music. They derive from these words. Then we also have reference to Veena like instrument that I told you earlier. And also we have reference to the chandas, the meter and rhythm as a musical structure. That also appears in the Rig Vedic literature itself. Then going on to Samaveda, it is the world's first systematic musical text. For example, the verses are set to melodic patterns, which are the Saman melodies in the Samaveda, where each Saman has notes. These are the swaras that we have. In the ancient Vedic music, we had three of them, three-note music, one high, one low, and so on. This is the germs of the Indian scale itself starts from these notes. Now, it was a precursor also to the Saptaswara, the seven swara system Sariga. They are explicitly codified later in Natya Shastra, but the roots of that, like I said, are in the Samaveda itself. And also in Samaveda, we have several instruments, like I've hinted earlier. We got the veena, we got the dundubi, we got the cymbals, we got war drums, and specific vocalizations done by the priests during the melodic chanting. All these things are there that shows us the antiquity of this music here. Then looking at the other Vedic literature like Yajurveda, Atharva Veda, we have mention of veena, musical chants, in rituals. Already talked to you about Taittiriya Samhita. They emphasize a proper intonation of swara that is very necessary, sound purity. Like I hinted to you earlier, the person should be well versed in all these things. So it lays emphasis that you must sing in tune. You should not be off key and all these kinds of things. Atharva Veda is referencing music even for healing and for emotional effects. So this is the precursor to the ragas. The ragas came later, the raga philosophy. But the roots of that is in Atharva Veda itself, because it's talking about emotional effects of music, healing, and things like that. It's also referencing dundubi, the veena, and other instruments. Now, other Vedic literature like the Brahmanas and the Upanishads, they too talk about music. For example, the Chandogya Upanishad. This is the earliest philosophy of music. In fact, in 1.3.1, it says the Saman is the essence of the Rik and the Yajus. Speech is its body and breath is its soul. It also discusses how the Saman itself arises from Om, thereby linking sound with the music, cosmos, consciousness, and so on. And there are several Brahmanas that describe the melodic structure, they describe the technical classifications of chanting. So it's a very formal musicology. So we cannot imagine that musicology is very recent. It actually goes back to Vedic literature where some of these formalizations have been done. We also find music in the epics, the itihasas, the later texts. For example, the Mahabharata in the Shanti Parva or the Ramayana in the Ayodhya Kanda. They are talking about court musicians, where there are people who are singing, dancing, and raga-like performance contexts are there. And so amazing things are there in it. I already talked to you about Bharata Muni's Natya Shastra, which first codified a musical treatise. This is describing the Saptaswaras, Sari, Gama, Padani. It is mentioning musical instruments. It is mentioning raga, rasa concepts. These are coming over here. It talks about scales. It talks about modes, orchestra layout. All of these things are mentioned, which calls for a very deep maturity with music. Already by the time of Bharata Muni's Natya Shastra, we are seeing all of these things. So Rig Veda, like I said, has many instances of Saptaswara. When we talk about how old are the scales, the Saptaswara scales, we can say the roots go back to the Rig Veda itself. And when we are asked for the evidence, there are several references. I hope the slide which is shown now will tell you that. For example, Rig Veda 1.164.3 up to 5, they're talking about 7 sisters. And those 7 sisters, 7 voices, all of those things are references to the Saptaswara. In one more place, it is talking about Rig Veda 10.71.3 and 4. Of those who see speech, the wise know the 7 forms. The 7 forms are the Saptaswara, once again. In one more place, the Purusha Suktam is talking about with 7 enclosing, thrice 7 stands, the universe is woven. Once again, 7 is coming over here. So what we're seeing is the Saptaswara was clearly known and used as a metaphor in the Rig Veda itself. So what I've done so far is I've talked to you about the archaeological finds in Indian music. I talked to you about instruments and so on. I also talked to you about the textual evidences. I pulled out a few references here and there that are talking about music, starting from Rig Veda, going on to the Brahmanas, Upanishads, Itihasas, and other texts, including Natya Shastra. Clear evidence is there of the growth of music. It grows in complexity with time, showing more and more maturity with the practice of music. Now, I'd like to address to you the application of mathematics itself in music. Now, you should know that Indians developed mathematics to a very high degree. Nothing like that was there anywhere else in the world, especially the algebra forms and the place value and other things. These are deeply developed in India, and this is clearly applied to music itself. For example, the musical scale and intervals, in order to do that, mathematical ratios were used, right, in order to define the Saptaswaras, and including the division of the octave into the 22 shrutis or the microtones. Once again, mathematics was used over there. Now, if you look at the Natya Shastra, Bharata Muni's Natya Shastra, he is using mathematics to model the string length and the pitch. right? We know that string length and pitch are related. I'll show that to you a little later. So Bharata Muni is talking about these things. Later works like Sharangadeva in Sangeeta Ratnakara, they integrate arithmetic and geometric progressions in order to structure the tala itself, the rhythm. So we are seeing integration of mathematics and music from a very, very early period of time. So when I'm talking to you about scales, I must now talk to you about how did that evolution happen. So we are seeing that in the Samagana, we are seeing the three notes only, right? The Uddata, Anuddata, and the Swarita. So we're seeing these three things. So the early music, perhaps with songs like Gaga Re, Re Re Sa, and these kind of compositions. Then if you go on to later literature, we are seeing the evolution of the seven notes itself. For example, the Chandogya Upanishad, that is mentioning the division of the octave into 22 parts. Shruti is the smallest interval of pitch which our ear can make out. The response of sound to our ear is logarithmic. We have a logarithmic response. And what can we decipher from one pitch to the other? That is the 22 Shrutis. That is the smallest part. The swaras were selected pitches to construct a scale, 7 per octave in Natya Shastra. That's what we have. And in India, we never had knowledge that was independent of our philosophy. So we had the swaras associated with divinities. Sa was Agni, Ri was Brahma, Ga was Saraswati, Ma was Mahadeva, Pa was Lakshmi, Dha was Ganesha, and Ni was Surya. So we have these kind of associations in addition. And if you look at the Chandogya Upanishad, we have clear evidence how the 7 swaras to 22 Shrutis, that is laid out in the Chandogya Upanishad. And this slide will show you that. Now, we are talking about mathematics. So in Natya Shastra, Bharata Muni, he introduces the concept of Shruti, which is the smallest audible pitch difference. And he divides the octave into 22 Shrutis. So the primary notes are the Saptaswaras, and they are assigned specific positions in this framework. For example, Sa has got 4 Shrutis, Ri has got 3 Shrutis, Ga has got 2 Shrutis, Pa has got 4 Shrutis, Ma has got 4 Shrutis, Pa has got 4, Dha has got 3, Ni has got 2. So this distribution is clearly showing an understanding of the inverse proportional relationship between string length and the pitch. For example, if you've seen the veena, if you have an open string on the veena, you'll get the low frequency note. But as you press on each of the frets, you're reducing the string length, and you see that the frequency keeps going up. So this understanding is clear in Bharata Muni's works and so on. There's a mathematical relationship between these two things. And he says for stringed instruments, by adjusting the string length, you can get the desired pitches. That is what he says. The notes arising from the body of the veena are to be known from these kinds of things. So the relationship we have is frequency is inversely proportional to the length of the string, where F is a frequency, L is a vibrating length of the string, and this relationship is known to ancient Indians, using which they have designed the octave. And there's a clear correspondence between these two things, the string ratio and the notes that we have. We are also seeing with time from ancient to medieval, there's been an evolution. So I talked to you so far about very ancient music, right? Talked to you about Rig Vedic time, Samaveda, talked about the time, Chandogya Upanishad, we talked about that. Then from there we went to Bharata Muni's codifying of all of these things. Now coming down in time, we can come to Sharangadeva itself, Sangeeta Ratnakara, 13th century work. There is listing 267 ragas. What it is telling us is in this time frame, we have got deep understandings of music and development of musical structures itself. This is a common musical tradition in northern India as well as southern India. It is not as if we had two different music traditions. This is the same musical tradition. But somewhere along the way, we were differentiated into southern Carnatic music and northern Hindustani music. I know there are some people who say that northern Hindustani music has got Persian and Turkic influences. I don't buy that at all, because Indian music, I'll show you later, has gone out of India into Arabia in 700 current era, if not earlier itself. and they've used Indian music to develop their own music, and there's a reconvergence back to India. So to call it Persian influence is a slight misunderstanding over there. Anyway, we are seeing in southern India, we got the greats, Purandaradasa, who was a father of Carnatic music itself. They were all in Vijayanagar kingdom, southern kingdoms over here. We have Tyagaraja, Muthuswami Dikshitar, Shyama Shastri. These are the trinity of Carnatic music. And in the northern tradition, we got Jayadeva, going back to the 11th century, Vidyapati, and several others like Mirabai, Tansen, and Muslims like Amir Khusro and others. They were under the patronage of the Delhi Sultanate, whereas in southern India, patronage of Vijayanagar Empire. Anyway, music has evolved to a great degree from that time. I'd like to talk to you now about the relationship between Indian music and Western music. The Westerners are very fond of saying that music developed independently in India and the West, but I find that highly suspicious. Why would the same tonal ratios be used to define the scales in India and in the West? That's a question that we should ask ourselves. If we see this chart that I'm showing over here, 22 Shrutis are mapped to 12 semitones. In the European practice, octave was divided into 12 semitones of exactly the same width. They were called cents, right? So the whole thing was 1200 cents from C to C there in their notation for one full octave. And each semitone was 100 cents each. That was the division that they saw. And there's a tonal relationship between Carnatic, Hindustani, and Western. For example, when we have our Saregama along with the in-between notes over here, the 12 semitones, we can map them onto the piano keyboard and we can know exactly, for example, the Sa can correspond to C on the piano keyboard and so on. The white keys on the piano keyboard would be the same Saregama, Padani. And there are people who studied the history of transmission from Samaveda to Greeks itself. For example, this Westerner called Bharati and Phedagone in his works on studies on Samaveda. So he says the oldest form of Samavedic scale was a pentatonic scale. And he's also referencing how from a very, very early time, the minute musical intervals were studied in India. And he also suspects that Pythagoras at the same time somehow has got the same musical structure going in over there too. We'll develop this a little later. But looking at Pythagoras, he used something called circle of fifth. We have an exact analogy in Indian music also, which is equivalent to the circle of fifth, in which this tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. This kind of a pattern emerges for the major scale in the Western system, and there's a very similar raga that we have in the Indian system too. So Pythagorean music, it was done the ratio of 3:2. I don't want to go into the details over here, but it is very clear that Indians were doing this much earlier than the Greeks were doing it. And after Pythagoras is where Western music is known. And exactly the same kind of tuning is used in the Greek tradition also. So this should lead us to think that some kind of transmission has happened from India to Greece. I'll talk about this a little later. So the 7-note so-called Lydian scale, for example, is the same as a Kalyani raga. So we have got these kind of correspondences in addition where you have 3 whole notes, a semitone, then 3 more whole notes and a final semitone. So this kind of a raga structure is the same as the Lydian scale. And we can also see scientifically the frequencies from C to C sharp to D sharp, E, F sharp, and so on. We can see the frequency differences. And in the Indian Shruti system and the swaras, we can see the different frequencies and compare it to the Greek. And we see the correspondences are almost exact over here. Now, how did all these things come about? I hinted to you that mathematics was used, right? So in the Indian tradition, the Shulva Sutras now go all the way back to Baudhayana. They go to Apastamba, Manava, Katyayana. So they have developed things like right angle triangles, a lot of geometry, algebraic solutions, square roots, numerals, and many other such kinds of things. So in Shatapatha Brahmana, Clearly, this kind of information is also used to construct Vedic altars, for example, right-angled triangles and these things. So clearly, these are overlapping time frames for Baudhayana, for Shatapatha Brahmana, Rishi Yajnavalkya, and so on. And this knowledge has gone to West Asia at a certain period of time, which I'll talk to you presently. A few slides down, I'll talk to you about that. Now, the interesting thing to see is that from Silver Sutras, we have got knowledge going to Pythagoras. Now, Pythagoras, as you know, in every high school kid will say Pythagorean theorem. But clearly the knowledge for this theorem is there in ancient Indian works itself. So he believed in the ideas about the soul, transmigration, what today we call reincarnation. Pythagoras believed in these things. He was also a pure vegetarian. He would not take meat of any kind, no beans, no wine, no meat. And he constantly worked towards an attainment of purification of the body and purity in order to interact the cosmos or the divine, a word that he coined, meaning for Brahman basically. And he saw music as a holy, spiritual, scientific endeavor. So he promoted the fundamental idea for musical theory that by dividing the length of a string into a ratio of half, third, quarter, fifths, you can create the octave. Why is this surprising? Because Shilva Sutras is all about using string to find geometric ratios. And we saw Bharata Muni and others who are talking about these ratios to construct the octave and other such things. And Pythagoras is talking about exactly the same things. So we are seeing there's a connection of Pythagoras with ancient India. And these slides will hopefully give you a little more information. So Pythagoras is dated to approximately 570 to 495 BCE. And several Westerners like Albert Burke, A.N. Marlowe, and G.R.S. Mead, they all say Pythagoras went to India. It is in India where he got his knowledge systems from. And there are papers that talk about how Pythagoras believed in reincarnation also. Now, the strange thing is, after Pythagoras returned from India back to Greece, he became a vegetarian. He started a Gurukulam style of school, and he believed in reincarnation. Clearly, he had internalized Vedantic ideas along with his knowledge systems and has returned to Greece. So if you compare Indian music with Pythagorean music, some amazing things fall out. For example, Indian music was set up with Shilva Sutras and mathematics with strings. That was used for the ratio of the swaras. Pythagoras used the exact string ratio to define the notes. Now, Samaveda started with 3 notes. The number 3 is sacred for Pythagoras. So 3 by 2 is a ratio starting point for scale. So it's encoded over here. Now, the Samavedic swara system has got 7 notes, and the diatonic music of Pythagoras is also based on the 7 notes. From 22 shrutis in the Indian system, we get 12 semitones, we get 7 swaras. In the Pythagorean music, from 12 semitones, we get the 7 notes. In India, swaras are associated with divinities, and music is used in Samavedic chants initially. And Pythagoras also, he did not want to use music for common purposes. It was used for holy purposes, spiritual purposes, just like Samagana, for example. And in India, Saraswati was a patron of music, whereas for Pythagoras, it was a female divinity called Muses. So Muses was supposed to be the patron of learning and music. So what are we seeing here? We are seeing music was handled by Pythagoras in the exact same way music was handled in India. Whether it is in the theory or the practice, we are seeing similarities. So with that as a background, I'd like to now talk to you about music in other cultures. So far, I only talked to you about music in India, and you might have some questions. What about other parts of the world? What kind of music did they play in ancient times? Well, from Europe, we have a specimen which I'm showing to you on the slide now. It comes from Germany. It is a bone flute, hollow bone flute with some holes on it, which is dated to 35,000 years ago. Yes, you heard that right, 35,000 years ago. But there's some skepticism. Is this really a flute? Because the tonal ratios are all totally off. Or is this some bones that have been chewed by bears and therefore you have holes on that? The people are pretty unsure, but the Europeans are passing this off as the earliest bone flute. What we know for sure is in China. In China, in the Henan province, we have 8,000-year-old 7-hole flutes. These are made from bird bones. Birds have got in their wings hollow bones. With those hollow bones, these musicians in China have made 7 holes appropriately, and they are reproducing approximately, it's not the exact saptaswara that we have, but more or less it is coming close to saptaswara. So this is evidence that has been found from graves, from graveyards in China, 8,000-year-old. They recovered many of these kinds of flutes. And if you see these slides, you can make these things out. There is also a paper that claims that from Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets from 2000 BCE, there is a claim by a person called Anne Kilmer that it references music, ancient music, and she's tried to reproduce that in Western music concepts, and claims that it is a Lydian scale. Lydian scale we saw was the same as the Kalyani Raga, and she's showing these things over here. Then if we go to Egypt, ancient Egypt, we have references from 1350 BCE in some tombs. We are seeing some paintings of Egyptians who are dancing and playing musical instruments. And also the lute. Lute is a stringed instrument, looks like the veena, and that also is there in Egyptian tombs coming from 1350 BCE. Then in the Mycenaean Greece, going to 1300 BCE, we are again seeing lyre that is used, which is very similar to the ancient venas that we had. We are seeing these things in Greece. So far, I talked to you about how mathematics was used to create the tonal ratios, different tonal ratios, the string length, and all these things. Mathematics was used for that. But mathematics was also used for rhythm, to find the rhythm, the thala, and others. That is also used over there. I'd like to quickly talk to you about that. So it's a pretty central role as far as thala is concerned, the cyclical counting of and beat division and so on. So we find to find the rhythm patterns, whether it is rhythmic cycles called thala system, there too for the teen tal or the rupak tal or the adi thala, each of them involve counting the beats in a certain way. The tempo and subdivision called layakari, there too we have got the use of mathematics over there. And going on to different permutations and combinations, the musicians are able to arrange short beats and long beats in such a way that various permutations and combinations can be explored. And this is what we are seeing in Indian music. There's a deep integration of music and mathematics. I'd like to talk to you about Manjul Bhargava, who in his work Poetry, Daisies and Cobras, he talks about how Pingala and Hemachandra, how they use the so-called Fibonacci sequence. For example, if you have a short syllable, 1 beat, and a long syllable, 2 beats, our question is, how many rhythms are there if you have n beats? For example, if n is 1, you have 1 beat. If you have n equal to 2, you can have 1, 2, or you can have a long beat, 1, 2. If you have n equal to 3, I can have 3 short beats, 1, 2, 3, or I can have short beat, long beat, right? Short beat, long beat, 1, 2. Or I can have long 1, 2, 1. If n is equal to 4, I can have 1, 2, 3, 4. Or I can have 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so on. So there are different ways in which the short beat and the long beat could be arranged so that you can have different kind of patterns over here. The question then is, for a given n, how many arrangements of short beat and long beat are there? And the answer to this is a so-called Fibonacci sequence, but which Hemachandra, in the year 1150 current era, he discovered this, and it is a so-called Fibonacci sequence, n plus 1th number. That is the number of patterns there is. Very interesting to know how mathematics is being used, including in Konakol rhythm, for example. There too, the Fibonacci pattern is made use of. Konakol is the verbal rhythm patterns that we do, and there too we see this kind of rhythm over here. Moving on, the last topic in my talk is the transmission of music. I've hinted to you throughout the talk that Indian music impacted the Babylonians, the Greeks through Pythagoras and so on. I'd like to talk to you a little bit of that. In my talks, I've addressed in depth about these. I'm just going to summarize it over here. We have got how knowledge systems have gone out of India in various time frames to different geographies. I have evidences for each of these things. Here in this slide, I'm showing to you how Indian knowledge went to Sumeria and beyond between 3000 BC to 1200 BCE, how it went initially in 3000 BC to Sumeria, then in 2000 BCE, how we had a monsoon failure, 100-year monsoon failure in India, where Indians have settled in the Fertile Crescent, meaning the Tigris River Valley, the Euphrates River Valley, and the Nile River Valley. And they've taken their knowledge systems with them. And from there, the Hittites has gone to the Minoan culture in ancient Greece. So all this evidence is there. So the knowledge systems that have gone here have included the Indian musical systems also have gone out in this time frame. Going on to the time frame of 600 BC to 200 BCE, we have got evidences of Greeks, scholars like Pythagoras, like Democritus, like Pyrrhon, and several others who have directly come to India and taken knowledge systems over there. Democritus, for example, and Pythagoras, I talked to you about music. And so this information is also available. A lot of evidences are shown in this slide, or you can go and refer to my talk where I show these things. Then we also had trade routes. For example, the Indo-Roman trade. This used to happen between 200 BC till about 400 current era. So the Romans from the Mediterranean Sea would land at Alexandria in Egypt, and through a land bridge, they go up in the caravans up to the Red Sea. In the Red Sea, Indian ships would be waiting for them. That will take them all the way through the Red Sea, Arabian Sea to the west coast of India, where they do trades. And when the monsoon winds are right, they reverse the journey. This was also a forum for knowledge transmission from India to the Roman Empire and so on. We also had the same time frame, the Silk Road. The Silk Road was an informal trade network, overland trade network from Southeast Asia, China, India, Central Asia, all the way to Mediterranean countries. Even during that time frame, we have evidences of knowledge transmission. So this way, there are several routes in which Indian knowledge has gone out to Babylon, to Egypt, to Greece, to Arabia. Through the Jews, it has gone to Armenia and Syria. This evidence we have from 400 BC to 1800 current era, how Indian knowledge has gone to these areas. Then finally, the Muslim transmissions. After Bin Qasim invaded Sindh in 711 current era, a whole lot of Indian knowledge also was taken, translated. This includes music, and that's how Arabian music itself was born out of some of the Indian musical traditions. And so this knowledge is injected into Spain, Northern Africa, and other places, and from there diffused into rest of Europe, as I show in this particular slide. From Toledo, Indian knowledge that has been translated into Arabic, and from Arabic it is translated into Latin, and from there to spread out to Europe between 1000 to later time frames. So the reality is that we have a whole lot of out-of-India transmissions, though these are not acknowledged in textbooks, which mostly reflect a Eurocentric worldview. But with evidence, we can reconstruct this picture that I'm showing you over here, where in different time frames, different geographies, Indian knowledge is impacted, which includes music. That is why we have the same music in India as well as the West. When we have a sa re ga ma pa da ni sa, why is the same as do re mi fa sol la ti do? It's the same thing, right? Same differences in ratios and other things. This similarity has come because they had a common origin. That common origin is in India, which is what I'm talking about over here. Similarity of music in different parts of the world, that suggests a common origin. Now, early transmissions influenced music in Babylon and Egypt, like I shown, all the way down to 2000 BCE and so on. This influenced them. Subsequent transmission, philosopher period, 600 BC, that influenced the Greeks, and in Indo-Roman trade time, the Romans also. After 700 current era, influenced Arabia in addition. And this music has reconverged in northern India to give rise to the Hindustani tradition. In parallel, we have the Carnatic tradition going on. I'd like to end this with one of the claims. A Western claim is that somebody called Guido of Arezzo, who lived approximately in the year 1000 and so on, he is credited with something called solfege. Solfege is the use of syllables, musical syllables, in order to teach music. So he got this ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, which he got out of the first letters of a Christian hymn. He used that to make this particular hymn. Later on, this became do, re, mi, fa. And ever since that, Europeans have been saying that it is Guido who invented solfege, and that was used to teach music. It became a very convenient tool to teach music. Now, is this true? The facts are totally different if you have heard the earlier part of my talks. We are seeing the Saptaswara system appeared in ancient works like the Rig Veda itself. Thousands of years before Gaido, Indians had already phonetically abbreviated the Sajja to Nishada system as Sa Re Ga Ma Pa Da Ni Sa. And the documented evidence is there, at least in Dattilam, Bharata Muni's Natya Shastra. We are seeing this at least 500 BC, if not earlier. We are seeing this. I just now talked to you about knowledge transmissions. I talked to you about transmissions from Pythagoras, from India to Europe. Greek travelers like Democritus, the Indo-Roman trade route from 200 BC to 400 current era, Muslim transmission 700 current era. These were the transmission mechanisms in which Indian music has gone from India into Arabia, into Europe, and from there they have erased out the Indian contributions, and now it's coming back, the Eurocentric assertion, as if this is an invention of the Europeans themselves. We need to be very aware of some of these things. In conclusion, so what we have covered today in this talk, we started out with some of the earliest archaeological references that are there for music in India. We presented several artifacts that clearly define the trajectory of musical knowledge in India. We showed from 12,000 years ago, if not earlier, in Bhimbetka, all the way to Harappa time frame, all the way to the temples that we have in Chalukyas, Pallavas, Hoysalas, and others. We have clear evidence of a musical tradition, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. Then we went on to the references of music in texts. I talked to you about references in the Rig Veda, in the Samaveda, Yajur, and Atharva Veda. We went on to the Upanishads, to the Brahmanas. We went on to Aranyakas. Then from there we went to Itihasas, then Bharata Muni's Natya Shastra. So we took references to music in each of these traditions, and we discussed several things. We talked about evolution of music from the 3-note system in the Samagana, going on to the 7-note Saptaswara, going on to semitones, going on to the 22 Shruti system. We talked about that in addition. Then we talked about mathematics, how mathematics was used to define the ratios, how were the ratios known, how ancient Indians, even perhaps from Bharata Muni, if not earlier, how they understood the relationship F is inversely proportional to the length of the string. Through that, they could define where the frets should be in the veena in order to create the various notes. We see this kind of information also over here. Then we talked about the influence of Indian music on the world cultures, where we talked about transmissions from India to various parts of the world. We talked about Pythagoras, and we talked about how Pythagoreans' understanding of music mirrors literally whatever we have developed in ancient India. So with that, I conclude this talk. So thank you so much for your interest. Namaste.